Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into something that could really shake things up for American small businesses. That's the potential for tariffs on goods coming from the European Union. This was an idea, floated under the former Trump administration.
Right. And we're looking at an article here by Chris Lehnes, who's a factoring specialist, from May 27th, 2025. It helps frame the potential shockwaves.
Exactly. And our goal isn't just to, report the headlines. We want to really understand the ripple effects, how this stuff might actually hit the small businesses in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about going deeper than the surface level. Lehnes' piece, I think, does a pretty good job highlighting how uniquely tricky international trade can be for smaller companies.
Okay.
And these potential tariffs, they really put those vulnerabilities under a microscope.
So let's start with the basics. When we say EU tariffs, how does that actually work? What's the mechanism?
Well, basically, a tariff is just a tax. It's a tax the government puts on goods coming into the country from somewhere else. So right away, it makes those imported goods more expensive. And, we've seen this play out before, haven't we?
Yeah. With steel and aluminum?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When the last administration put tariffs on European steel and aluminum, the EU hit back. They targeted American stuff like Harley-Davidson bikes, Kentucky bourbon.
Right. I remember that tit for tat.
That retaliation is a really key part of the whole picture. You can't really look at tariffs without thinking about that reaction.
So this new proposal or potential proposal, is it just more of the same? Or are we talking something different in scale?
Well, the article suggests it could be much broader this time. We're talking potential tariffs from maybe 10 up to 30%.
Wow, 30%.
Yeah. And not just on specific things like steel, but potentially on all goods coming in from the EU.
All goods. That's huge.
It is. And that's why, there's quite a bit of concern swirling around in the business community here, especially among those smaller firms that really rely on trade with Europe.
Okay, this is where I think we need to get into the weeds a bit. How does a, say, 10 or 20% tariff on some French wine or German part actually cause problems for a small business owner here?
Okay, so for a lot of these smaller businesses, importing from the EU isn't like a luxury item thing.
Yeah.
It's often about getting very specific materials or unique products they really need.
Right. Essential stuff.
Essential stuff. Think about maybe a small fashion designer in New York.
Uh-huh.
They might depend on really high-quality Italian fabrics for their line.
Okay.
Or maybe a restaurant, a farm-to-table place that features specific French wines you just can't get domestically. Or even a small tech company out west using specialized German components.
Got it.
A tariff on those imports, it just directly jacks up their costs.
And the big difference here compared to, say, a giant corporation is their ability to just sort of eat that cost, right? Or change suppliers quickly.
Absolutely. A huge company might have the clout to go back to their supplier and say, hey, you need to lower your price to help us cover this tariff.
Yeah, they have leverage.
They have leverage. Or they have global supply chains already set up. Maybe they can pivot to a supplier in, Vietnam or Mexico relatively quickly. Small businesses, usually not so much. They often run on thinner margins anyway.
Right.
And they might have really strong relationships with specific EU suppliers based on quality, maybe reliability, sometimes just personal connections built over years.
So suddenly facing a 10, 20% price hike on something essential, that's got to hurt.
It really squeezes them. They're faced with, raising their own prices and maybe losing customers.
Yeah, in a tough market.
Or just absorbing the cost and watching their already thin profit margin shrink even more, which, might not be sustainable long-term for a small outfit.
Their article mentions that example of a small wine distributor in California specializing in European wines. A 20% tariff on French or Italian wines. You can see how that could be devastating.
Oh, totally. For a business like that, European wines aren't just like one product line. That's their whole thing.
It's their identity.
It's their identity, their niche. A 20% price jump could just kill demand. It might force them to, drastically cut back what they offer, which disappoints their customers.
Or they just become uncompetitive compared to distributors selling, say, Chilean or Australian wine.
Exactly. It could really threaten their entire business model.
So, okay, that's the direct cost increase. But the article also talks about supply chain disruptions. How do tariffs mess things up beyond just the price?
Well, tariffs basically throw a wrench into the works. They create uncertainty and complexity.
Okay.
Think about those U.S. manufacturers, even small ones, who rely on really specific, maybe high-tech tools or machinery components from Europe.
Right, things you can't just get anywhere.
Precisely. Stuff that's critical for their quality, maybe meeting certain standards. Finding an equivalent alternative might be really difficult or maybe impossible or just take a long time. And then you have the practical stuff. New tariffs can mean more customs checks, delays at the port, new paperwork.
Ugh, paperwork.
Yeah, exactly. Businesses have to figure out how to comply with new rules, and that takes time. And even just the threat of tariffs can cause problems. Businesses might hesitate, do I place that big order now if I don't know what it'll cost next month?
That uncertainty sounds really tough, especially for newer businesses, maybe startups, ones that don't have, backup plans already in place.
Oh, definitely. Startups, businesses trying to grow, they often run on really tight schedules. They need predictable access to their supplies.
Right.
A sudden delay getting a key part because it's stuck in customs due to some new tariff rule. That could mean missing deadlines, failing to fill orders.
Which can really damage your reputation when you're just starting out.
Absolutely. It could be a huge setback for a young company trying to build momentum.
Oh.
And think about investment, too.
How so?
Well, if there's all this ambiguity about future trade policy, future costs,
Yeah.
are you going to commit to expanding your factory? Buying new equipment that relies on imported parts? Probably not.
Yeah, you'd pause, wait and see.
Exactly. That kind of uncertainty can really put the brakes on investment and growth, especially in the small business sector.
Okay, so we've covered the pain for U.S. importers, but you mentioned retaliation earlier. The article stresses that too. Tariffs aren't usually a one-way street, are they?
No, definitely not. And history gives us a pretty clear lesson here.
Like with the bourbon and motorcycles?
Exactly. When the U.S. hit EU steel and aluminum, the EU didn't just slap a tariff on everything American. They were strategic. They picked iconic products from states that were, let's say, politically important.
Ah, okay. So they targeted specific pressure points.
Precisely. Kentucky bourbon, Wisconsin motorcycles, North Carolina tobacco, I think sweet potatoes too. It was a calculated move designed to get the attention of certain lawmakers.
So if these broader tariffs on, all EU goods happen, what kind of retaliation could we expect this time? And who gets hit?
Well, you got to remember, the EU is a massive market for us. Huge. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative says it's our second largest trading partner overall.
Second largest.
Wow. Yeah. So if they decide to retaliate, they have a lot of options. They could target anything from, American farm products, manufactured goods, maybe even digital services.
So small American companies that export stuff to Europe could suddenly find themselves facing tariffs over there.
That's the risk.
Yeah.
Businesses that worked really hard to build up sales in, say, Germany or France could suddenly see their products become way more expensive for European buyers.
Making them less competitive.
Less competitive, maybe even priced out completely.
The article uses that example of a small cheesemaker in Vermont selling artisanal cheese to France or Germany.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Imagine you're that cheesemaker. You spent years maybe building relationships with distributors in Paris, getting your cheese into specialty shops.
Right.
Suddenly, a new EU tariff makes your Vermont cheddar 25% more expensive than a local French cheese.
Ouch. Yeah, your sales could just dry up.
Exactly. It could just devastate those export markets you worked so hard to build. It's not just lost sales. It's like the collapse of those international ties.
It sounds like it's not just the money either. The direct costs, the retaliation costs. The article also mentions the sheer hassle factor, the administrative burden.
Oh, yeah. That's a really important point, and one that maybe doesn't get enough attention.
Why is that?
Because dealing with international trade rules is already complicated.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a small company without, a whole department dedicated to this stuff.
Right.
Tariffs just add more layers of complexity. New regulations, new forms, changes in how goods are classified for customs. You mentioned paperwork earlier.
Yeah, more paperwork.
Lots more. Think about things like harmonized tariff schedule codes. There are these complex codes used to classify every product imaginable for customs. Tariffs can change how those codes are applied or interpreted.
So the small business owner who's already doing everything, sales, marketing, HR, now they also have to become an expert in complex international trade codes just to make sure they're filling out the forms right.
Pretty much. Or they have to spend money they might not have on consultants or lawyers to navigate it all.
Which takes time and resources away from actually running the business.
Exactly. It's a major drain. The extra paperwork, the potential for getting held up at customs, maybe facing audits. It's just a big administrative headache on top of everything else.
And what about us, the consumers? How might these tariffs change what people actually buy?
Well, it's pretty straightforward, right? If European products get noticeably more expensive because of tariffs, people are likely to look for cheaper options.
Makes sense.
So that can mean buying more American-made goods if comparable ones exist.
Yeah.
Or maybe buying similar products imported from countries that don't have these tariffs, like maybe from Asia or Latin America.
So good for some U.S. companies maybe, but bad for others.
Potentially. It could definitely hurt those small retailers or e-commerce sites that have carved out a niche selling, say, unique European clothing or foods or homewares.
Right, like that boutique selling Italian shoes you mentioned earlier. Their customers might switch to a different brand made somewhere else if the price jumps too much.
Exactly. And, there can be wider effects, too. Increased trade friction, this kind of economic tension. It could even sort of dampen enthusiasm for things like travel across the Atlantic.
Oh, interesting, like tourism.
Yeah, tourism, maybe cultural exchanges, study abroad programs. If the relationship feels more strained, it could subtly impact those sectors too, affecting small tour operators, hotels, educational consultants, that kind of thing.
Okay, let's pull back for the bigger picture. The article kind of hints that these tariff threats could be more than just a short-term issue, like maybe signaling a longer-term change in global trade alliances.
Yeah, that's a sort of geopolitical angle. The idea is if the U.S. is seen by the EU and maybe other big trading partners as, unpredictable, prone to suddenly changing the rules with tariffs.
They might start looking elsewhere.
They might. They could look to strengthen their trade ties with each other or maybe with China or other big emerging markets if they feel they can't rely on predictable trade with the U.S.
And the long-term effect of that could be isolating U.S. businesses.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially small businesses. They could find themselves sort of shut out from future opportunities in Europe over time. Think about fast-growing areas like green energy, digital tech, advanced manufacturing.
So like a small American tech company with some innovative new software, they might find it harder down the line to partner with European firms or sell into that market if the overall trade relationship is soured.
Precisely. They could miss out on investment, on partnerships, on access to a huge, wealthy market that's really pushing forward in those areas. It could mean a gradual reshaping of global supply chains and alliances that leaves U.S. small businesses kind of on the outside looking in.
Wow. So wrapping this all up, it sounds like these potential EU tariffs, when you really dig in, present this whole complicated mess of challenges for small U.S. businesses. It's way more than just a tax. It's rising costs, yes, but also supply chain chaos, the real danger of retaliation hitting U.S. exports, more paperwork, changing customer habits, and maybe even these big long-term shifts in who trades with whom.
That sums it up pretty well. I mean, the language around using tariffs to protect domestic jobs can sound appealing, right?
Sure.
But the reality, especially for small businesses that operate in our very interconnected global economy today, they're often the ones who are most exposed, most vulnerable when these kinds of trade barriers go up.
It really makes you think about, the need to look at the full picture, to really consider all these downstream consequences, and importantly, listen to the small business owners themselves when we're talking about trade policy.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, having a dynamic, thriving small business sector really depends on having a global marketplace that's reasonably predictable and reasonably open.
Well, thanks for helping us unpack all that. It's definitely complex.
My pleasure. And hopefully, it gives everyone a clearer sense of just how interconnected things are and what the real world stakes can be when we talk about trade policy like this.